It was the last class of the day, and Dwayne looked absolutely exhausted. He looked in rough shape. And it's kind of one of those things where everybody else notices, but you don't want to be the first one to ask what's wrong with you. Have you ever had a day where you feel fine and someone looks at you and they're like, "Are you feeling okay?" And you're like, "Yeah, why?" And they're like, "You look sick." I mean, that just ruins your day. Especially if you're feeling fine. If you feel sick, whatever. But if you feel fine, you're like, "Well, what's wrong with the way I look?" So you don't ever want to be the first person to ask that question, but enough of us were talking about it and staring at him for long enough that somebody had to ask. And so I volunteered. I'm like, "Hey, Dwayne, you all right?" He's like, "I'm exhausted." We're like, "Well, that's obvious for all to see." It's like, "I got up at 4:30 this morning and I walked to school." We're like, "Why?" Now, Dwayne drove and he had a car and he had a nice car. And we're like, "Did you get grounded? Did your parents take your car away?" It's like, "No. Last night, I was driving around the school. The school was pulled back from the road a little bit, so there was a ring road around the school. And they had speed limit signs posted that you should go 5 or 10 miles an hour. It's a school." Dwayne thought differently. And in the process of that, he saw some lights in his rearview mirror. And recognizing, at this time in history, there was a show called Cops. I don't know if they still air Cops or not, but on Saturday nights, they would show Cops, and they'd be involved in chases and other things, and it generally isn't a good idea to try to outrun the police. And so he recognized this, and he stopped. And the cop came up, and he took his license, and there was nothing he could really do because it wasn't a road that, so I guess technically he could have done something. But what he did was he brought him back his license, and he informed Dwayne that he had written down his information. He knew where he lived, and Dwayne was now on his crap list. And Dwayne decided that he was not going to drive for the next day. So Dwayne got up at 4:30 in the morning and got ready, and then walked 3 miles to school that morning. And in the process of us talking about this, one of them said, "Don't you think if the police were going to do something, they would have just followed you home last night?" And he started thinking. And then we said, "Do you really think that officer has nothing better to do with his life than follow Dwayne around?" And he's like, "Yeah, I guess you guys are right." And this was the last class of the day. So as the bell rang, we all went to our lockers and we were walking out of school together. And sure enough, standing on the sidewalk in full uniform was that police officer. Dwayne did not drive for a week. He was absolutely paranoid. He was paranoid because of that encounter. And here he was having to wake up at an incredible early hour in the morning and walk to school, all because he was anxious and he was paranoid. Now, we look back on that, and that's a funny example of something somebody was doing, something they shouldn't have done, and the results that they had to live with. The reality is, circumstances and situations like Dwayne that I went to school with are increasingly becoming the norm, not in that people are speeding around schools, but in that especially amongst our younger population. We're seeing levels of anxiousness and anxiety and paranoia and unrest in numbers we've never recorded before. And it's not just the younger generation. We have a mental health crisis going on. 20% of American adults regularly experience symptoms of anxiety and depression. That's 1 in 5. That's regularly. In the last 20 years, deaths by suicide and addiction have more than doubled. And their rates, unfortunately, continue to rise. 40% of high school students struggle with persistent feelings of sadness and hopelessness. 40%. Persistent feelings of sadness and hopelessness. That's an increase of 40% in the past decade. Children and young adults, 10 to 24, account for 15% of all suicides. an increase of over 52% in the past 25 years. So this is our reality. This is what's unfolding. This is what's happening all around us. And it's not just around us. For many that are in this room, you've experienced this. Some of you are in the midst of walking through it right now. And what we're hoping to do over the next few weeks is we're hoping to look at real examples from individuals in Scripture who dealt with anxiety, who dealt with depression, with grief, feelings of hopelessness. And ultimately, we're going to explore the antidote that's out there for it all. If you have your phones or your tablets, I invite you to follow along with us this morning in the Bible app. It's a free resource that you can find in whatever app store you utilize on your device. And once you have the Bible app installed on your device, the feature that we use together each and every week is called the Events feature. You can either enable your location or right in Lakeside, Algoma will pop up, and you can follow along with us that way. If you have a traditional Bible with you this morning, we're going to be in the Old Testament book of 1 Kings. 1 Kings chapter 19. And if you're joining us via the stream this morning, thanks so much for joining us. My name's Brian. I'm part of the team here at Lakeside, and the verses will be available for you on the screen below as we're going to dive into 1 Kings 19 in just a moment. But before we do, reading these sobering statistics, knowing the reality of what many of us have encountered or what many of us walk through on a regular basis in our own homes, in our own families, in our own circumstances, in our own minds. As we go through this series, what I want you to know are a few things. The first is this, that we exist to be a place that points everyone that we encounter to the hope of Jesus. And unapologetically, we are going to do that. And we desire to love everybody that walks through these doors. And our goal in that is to meet people where they are. And for the love of God, not to stay there. But we want to meet people where they are. And so I don't know what kind of background you're coming from, but here's what I want to invite you into. It's kind of our philosophy, one of the ways that we do things here at Lakeside. And that is, this is core to who we are. There is this belief that when you walk through these doors, we don't want you to fake it. We don't want you to pretend that everything's great when your world's on fire. I sometimes in conversations delay as long as possible telling people what I do, and it's not because I'm ashamed of ministry, and it's certainly not because I'm ashamed of Jesus, but it's because as soon as people find out I'm a pastor, they change who they are. They change what we talk about. They change how they talk. They change what they'll tell me. And I'm no longer encountering an authentic person. And the last thing in the world that we want for you is to feel like you have to have it all together to walk in these doors or to feel like you have to put on a persona. What we want you to be is the individual, the person that you are. And we want to meet you right there because, spoiler alert, Jesus loves you and wants to meet you right there. And so I invite you, if these things are a struggle for you, to know that you have a team of people who loves you and who is willing to rally around you and willing to meet you right where you are, and you don't have to sanitize it. You don't have to dress it up. You also are under no obligation to do a trauma dump on people. There is no, you have no responsibility if you do struggle with these things to feel like, oh, well, I've got to share every detail of that with everyone there. If that will be cathartic for you, we will put you in touch with people who can help you journey through that. But you are under no obligation, and so I don't want anyone to walk out of this place and feel like, oh, well, now there's a responsibility for me to share things I'm not comfortable sharing. So I just wanted to share those disclaimers as we get this series underway. 1 Kings 19, beginning verse 1, we read this. Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. Now, that's a very interesting introduction if you haven't been following along with what's happened so far in 1 Kings. So we don't have time to look at it, so I'm going to try to catch you up. Ahab was an evil king. Ahab was an evil king, and he thought, it's not a big deal for me to sin against God. I'm the king. I can do what I want. And I'm going to sin. It's not really that much of a issue. I'll do what I want. God's over there, whatever. He also married a woman named Jezebel. Now, Jezebel worshipped a false god named Baal. You may have heard it pronounced Baal. You may have heard it pronounced Baal. You may have heard it pronounced Baal. We don't really know. I'm going to go with that pronunciation. But if, as I'm talking about the story, you're like, oh, that's what he's talking about, that's why I wanted to talk about that. Now, as a result of that marriage, guess what happens? Ahab then begins to worship Baal. Why? Well, because I'm sure there were ulterior motives. Elijah told Ahab in 1 Kings 17 that God, as a result of this, would withhold all dew and rain from the region for the next 3 years. Now, where we live, there's water towers everywhere. I don't really know what they do. Some of you are engineers and you're wanting to facepalm right now. Others of you are big into city councils. You also want to facepalm right now. And others of you are thinking, I have no idea either. But where we live, water is pretty readily available. Not so much here. So if there is going to be a drought for 3 years and there isn't going to be so much as dew, that is going to have massive implications on the food system. And it certainly does. So as a result of this message that God gives to Elijah, Elijah tells it to Ahab, who is an evil king. There's going to be a severe drought. There isn't even going to be dew. And then Elijah pieces out. He's like, I'm sure this isn't going to go over well, so he leaves. He leaves the region, which is just smart, and he goes to a different region for 3 years while the drought and severe famine were unfolding. Ahab is mad. So mad, in fact, that people were scared to even mention Elijah's name in his presence. And if you're like, this is really fascinating, it is. 1 Kings 17, check it out. Now, Elijah then met up with Ahab and proposed an event. He proposed an event where people would cry out to their pagan god, Baal, and Elijah would cry out to God and settle once and for all who is really worthy of worship. Now, 1 Kings 18 details this contest. So they set up 2 altars. There are 2 different bulls, one on an altar for Baal and one on an altar for God. Baal prophets go first, and they cry out to Baal for hours. And Baal doesn't exist. So when you cry out to nothing for hours, nothing happens. And after hours, Elijah, he begins to troll them. He taunts them in what is just some epic burns. And he's like, hey, shout louder. Maybe he doesn't hear you. And then the people shout louder. And he's like, hey, maybe he's out to lunch. Maybe he's busy. Or maybe he fell asleep because he's bored. So he just starts trolling them. And then the people shout louder and louder. And then they begin to mutilate themselves. They begin to cut themselves, as was their custom, thinking that if they would suffer, their God would respond. And nothing happens. Then Elijah rebuilds an altar. It'd been torn down. He rebuilds it. He cuts the bull into pieces and places it on the wood. He then has them pour water on everything 3 times so that everything is beyond soaked. And God supernaturally and miraculously provided the fire. And it burned up the bull, it burned up the altar, and Elijah had the people seize the prophets of Baal and slaughter them. And then God sent rain. That's 1 Kings 17 and 1 Kings 18. So then we get to 1 Kings 19, and what did we read? Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. And then we get to verse 2. And then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, so may the gods do to me and more also if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by this time tomorrow. That is a really kind of diplomatic way of saying, I'm going to kill you. You are dead. And Elijah has just now been given a death sentence. He's just been given a death sentence. from the queen. Then, as verse 3 tells us, he was afraid. And he arose and ran for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there. Not sure how I feel about being the servant in that scenario, but nevertheless, there we have it. Elijah hears this, he's afraid, and he flees. And he flees. He's been given a death sentence, God has sent the rain, and he runs out. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a broom tree, and he asked that he might die, saying, "It is enough. Now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am no better than my fathers." Elijah is isolated, and he's alone, and he's reached the point. He says, I just want to die. And some of you have been there. And some of you are there right now, where you are hanging on by a thread. And there are pressures and there are circumstances that are seemingly being surmounted against you, and it feels like there's no escape, and it feels like there's no hope, and it seems like you are in a hopeless situation that you can't win. And I just want to remind you that Elijah is a prophet, which means that these feelings can happen to people who walk with God. These feelings can happen to people who God has used in really powerful, incredible ways. These feelings are not necessarily a sign of spiritual immaturity. Elijah, in the midst of his circumstances, just says, God, kill me. I want to die. Now, I just want to pause here, because I just want to remind you what happened the day before. He was a witness to a miraculous instance from God. If I go kill a cow, and I cut it up into pieces, and I remove the cover of our fire pit over there, and I put it on the fire pit, and I cry out to God, God, rain fire down from heaven onto our fire pit. I hope you like steak tartare, because that cow is not getting cooked. This happened once. It was supernatural. It was miraculous. Can God do the supernatural? Absolutely. Can God do the miraculous? Yes, but this is not a normative experience. And I say all that to remind you what Elijah just saw. And here, hours later, he's at the point of, God, I want to die. Sometimes, after someone has taken their own life, people scratch their heads and they're like, I just talked to him a day before. Sometimes it's hours and I didn't notice that anything was wrong. And the reality is our circumstances can change our outlooks, and our circumstances can change our moods. Our circumstances can change our minds in an instant. we see it here. That Elijah goes from this miraculous event to wanting to die. And he lay down and slept under a broom tree, and behold, an angel touched him and said to him, "Arise and eat." So as he cries out to God, what does God do? God sends to him an angel. And I love this so much, because what the angel didn't say was, "Hey, Elijah, stop whining and remember yesterday. Remember the fire and remember the rain that hasn't happened for 3 years, and remember how God showed up on a grand scale. Yes, remember that." What I love is that the angel didn't say, "How can you have so little faith? What is wrong with you? Remember all that God's done." What I love is that the angel didn't show up and say, "Get over it. Your feelings aren't valid. Put your big boy pants on and let's go after the world." Now, the angel told him, "Get up and eat." That in the midst of his suffering, God makes him a meal. And he sends him an angel to encourage him. And the message is, get up and eat. And he looked, and behold, there was at his head a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. And he ate and he drank and he lay down again. And the angel of the Lord came again a second time and touched him and said, "Arise and eat, for the journey is too great for you." Elijah looks, and there's a freshly baked cake and a jar of water, and he ate and he lays back down, and the angel says, No, that's not enough. That's not enough. You go eat again. God meets us in the midst of our brokenness. He meets us in the midst of our darkest moments. He meets us in the midst of the places that we feel like we can't share and we can't talk about and we can't be honest about with anybody. God is willing to meet us there in the midst of our depression, in the midst of all of our deepest, darkest moments. And it isn't a message of condemnation. It's a message of, "I've made you a meal." And God will sometimes supernaturally intervene like that. But you know how else God intervenes? It's through His people. And this is why it's a call for us that we must be the community that God has designed us to be. So that people in the midst of their suffering, in the midst of those moments, when they say, "I just want to die," they know that there's support. And that support ultimately comes from God. But we have the opportunity to join people in the midst of their suffering. We have the opportunity to meet people in the midst of their deepest and darkest moments. And help them remember and help them see that hope is available. And he arose, verse 8 says, and he ate and he drank and went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mount of God. Elijah ate, and it was enough to sustain him for 40 days. In our weakness, God will sustain us. So Elijah eats that meal, and it strengthens him enough for 40 days and 40 nights, and he goes to the Mount of God. And there, he came to a cave, and he lodged in it. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him and said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And he said, "I have been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword, and I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away." God asks Elijah, "What's wrong?" And Elijah isn't shy about sharing his complaints. I don't know if you ever have this conversation with maybe a boss or a spouse or maybe God, where there's something that's obviously bothering you, and it's apparent to everyone that there's something bothering you. And when they ask, "Hey, what's wrong?" you respond with, "Nothing. I'm fine. Everything's great." Yeah, Elijah doesn't do that. Not even a little bit. He's like, "Well, God, you asked. Here's what's ticking me off. I'm out here doing your work, and all that's left is me. I'm the only one doing your work." God is big enough to hear our complaints. And you may feel like, I got some problems. I got some things I want to get off my chest. I've got some complaints I want to air, but I can't do that. And we should have reverence and honor for God at all times. But God is big enough to hear your complaints and your frustrations and your disappointments. And I hate to be the one to break this to you, but even if you don't cry out to Him about them in prayer, He already knows they're in your mind. And He can handle it. And so Elijah shares, "God, I see these people. And I want them to follow after you, but there's nobody else doing the work. Nobody else who seemingly cares about this." And he said, "Go out and stand on the mount before the Lord." And behold, the Lord passed by. And a great and strong wind tore the mountains and broke in pieces the rocks before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, the sound of a low whisper. God demonstrates in front of Elijah just a bit of all of His power and all of His wonder. And He brings about these storms. And first, there's these heavy winds, and He's looking, but God is not in the midst of those heavy winds. And then there's an earthquake, and the earth begins to shake, and God is not in the midst of those earthquakes. And then there's fires that are raging about. Think of all the natural disasters that we have: hurricanes and tornadoes, earthquakes, fires. And God isn't in the midst of that fire either. And then Elijah hears a whisper. And when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And behold, there came a voice to him and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And he said, "I have been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword, and I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away." And Elijah has the same complaint. But the way that God communicated to him was not in the winds of a hurricane or a tornado. It wasn't as the whole earth began to shake in an earthquake. It wasn't in a raging fire. It was in the voice of a whisper. And sometimes in life, especially when things are difficult, and we find ourselves anxious, depressed, uncertain. Sometimes we think, well, I'm going to need this massive act of God. And sometimes we miss the message that God has for us entirely. Because it isn't in a wind of a hurricane or a tornado, and the movement of the earth beneath our feet, or the heat of fires raging all around us. But it's in a quiet whisper. And the Lord said to him, "Go return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. And when you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael to be king over Syria, and Jehu the son of Nimshi you shall anoint to be the king over Israel, and Elisha the son of Shaphat of Abel-Meholah you shall anoint to be prophet in your place. And the one who escapes from the sword of Hazael shall Jehu put to death, and the one who escapes from the sword of Jehu shall Elisha put to death. Yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him." And God, having heard the complaints of Elijah, then tells him his plan. Now, sometimes in life, our feelings are based on our circumstances. And because of our circumstances, anxiety and depression comes about. That was the case here. Remember this. God created us with feelings and emotions. It is not wrong to have feelings. It is not wrong to have emotion. But know this, our feelings and our emotions can lead us astray. We can't always just go with every one of our feelings. We can't always just go with every one of our emotions. But that does not mean that having feelings and having emotions are bad. They're not. It's the way that God designed us. So what do we do with all this? Well, I think it's important for us to remember that our feelings and our emotions can change rapidly. And just because we feel something today, it does not mean that we're going to feel that same way tomorrow or even later today. And when we find ourselves struggling, we don't have to keep that to ourselves. We don't have to go off into isolation. We don't have to be by ourselves. And we certainly don't have to keep that from God, who knows about it anyway. And so what I would encourage and challenge you to do is when you start to feel those things, instead of making prayer your last resort, if it's part of what you do at all, is go to God first with that. And remember that the God we serve is the same yesterday, today, and forevermore. And when Elijah was experiencing that, he made him a meal and told him to take a nap. And sometimes that's what we need to do. Is we need to rest. We need to recharge. We need to find things that fill us. We need to eat. It's important for us to remember that yes, God does the supernatural. Yes, He does the miraculous. But how did God speak to Elijah? In a whisper. And God has revealed His heart to us in Scripture. And so when you find yourself in the midst of your struggle, prayer and engaging Scripture are the first things to do, not the last. And as a community, let's just resolve collectively that we're going to be that community that goes into the midst of people's messes, in the midst of their stories, and journeys with them in the great times and when times are a challenge. God, thanks for loving us. Thanks for being willing and able to meet us in the midst of our struggles. Being a God who made Elijah a meal. And did the supernatural, and it was there in a quiet voice. God, I pray for the people right now whose circumstances are challenging. Who feel isolated and alone. And I pray, God, that you would fill them. Pray that people wouldn't put on a show. And collectively, we would resolve that we're going to meet people in the midst of their mess. God, I pray that their first response would be to cry out to you and to engage your heart. I pray we can come alongside of them and help them. Be glorified, Jesus, in the way we live our lives. We ask in